Buon pomeriggio.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your warm welcome. We're very surprised that we can all fit in here together. As you know, the topic of the meeting is Founders and Masters from Italian Cinema to Pixar. We thought with a couple of friends a couple of months ago that it would be interesting and stimulating to have a dialogue with starting from the title of the meeting with Goethe's sentence and this type of cultural expression, this artistic form which is cinema, which all of us in some way have had a part of. Our work is linked to cinema. So to begin this dialogue, we decided to start from 2 points of view. Animation cinema, Pixar, which I'm sure you all know very well, very much loved by many cinema lovers, by families, adults and children that have seen in these movies since '95 to today many interesting ideas that have touched on topics to do with life without censoring anything that span from life, topics of death and happiness, with many topics such as friendship and love, family and difficulties in life. And to speak about Pixar, we invited Armando Fumagalli. He's a university professor of the Catholic University of Milan, professor of Semiotics, History and Languages of the International Cinema, and he's also director of the Master Program in Screenwriting and Production at the Catholic University of the Sacred Heart. Many talents have flourished thanks to this course, and also Alessandro D'Avenia, to name one of these. The other point that we decided to focus on, we entrusted it to Francesco Amato. We wanted to talk about the wealth, the richness of cinema and its link to the present, and especially the genre of comedy. To do this, we will ask Francesco Amato to speak about this. He's a young director and scenographer. We will illustrate what he did during these years of his career, and his last movie, Lasciati andare, Let Yourself Go. To introduce the interventions, we will see some clips. Before we introduce Pixar, we will watch some clips from Pixar, and then we will speak about them.
Tutti grandi film, credo.
They're all good films, great films. I'm sure we're all in agreement on this. Fumagalli wrote many articles on Pixar. He is not only is not only studies, but he's also director of Vide, which is, he's the development consultant for Vide. And was also involved in the debut of the cinematographic realization of Bianca come il latte. How do these themes that we've seen in the clips create respect for Pixar? And how has the history of this 30-year-long organization developed? Good evening. Thank you for the invitation. I'm very passionate about Pixar. I try to follow Pixar and study it after from the 90s. It has a very interesting story, and I have a million anecdotes that I could talk about that are also linked to the title of the meeting. I'll only name a couple. Pixar begins during the 80s. It's a film studio, and its first production is in '95, Toy Story. And I'm convinced that it is the case. It is one of the most extraordinary successes in cinema history. There is no group of a single individual artists that have had such a great success on this kind of level. It is a before producing Toy Story, they were going towards bankruptcy, and Steve Jobs helped very much to keep it surviving yearly with a certain amount of money. But it, from being almost bankrupt in '95, 10 years later, it reached 7.2 billion. Of worth. We saw that the themes are very innovative and very detailed and very much cared for from this point of view. We can look at them from an anthropological, a Christian view. They're not religious films. The interesting thing is that Pixar begins from an idea to make something new from between a group of outsiders, young people that consider themselves outsiders. And Lewis Stanton says this, who is the director of Finding Nemo and WALL-E. When they were thinking about making the first Toy Story, they said, what do we want to do? Do we want to make a different kind of movie? We don't want, therefore, a beginning with a happy village, with the usual classic bad guy villain, with the main protagonist with a clear ideal, with the so-called want moment. So they go to the Disney and they propose the movie, and they said, if you want us to distribute your movie, the ingredients of your movie have to be happy village, the villain, the want moment, etc. So their first movie began, and the story of Toy Story is quite interesting because it seemed almost as if they went into a crisis and they didn't know whether to continue. Maybe there was another way of rewriting the whole script from scratch. Therefore, they have a way of, they think of a new way of making movies. Since he was a child, Louis Stanton wanted to work in movies. Sorry, John Latte. He talks about this. He was a very strong promoter of Disney. He went to a university which was specialized in arts, with a specialization in animation, organized for the most part by and directed by Disney. Then he started to work in Disney, and after 3 years, since he wanted to do animation, Disney saw his first animation video. Disney said, can we change this to make this a little bit more commercial? And he said, well, no, I like it the way it is. And they fired him in '83. We know that, in fact, 2006, John Lasseter then, there's a happy ending at the end of this story. John Lasseter, in fact, becomes chief of Disney as well as chief of Pixar. The fact that they have different movies is due to the fact that their success with the new movies such as Frozen and the most recent ones is in part thanks to John Lasseter's work. Ed Catmull, in a book which is called Creativity, identifies very well the risk that is involved in great industries. Many people ask each other what would have happened if Walt Disney had continued to work. There's a wrong way to consider this question. With a new leadership between the 80s and the 90s, which sees leadership as needing to be excessively looking towards the past, so therefore a refusal of change. And Ed Catmull says it at the same time. He says it also with regards Pixar. I promised everyone that Pixar would never have changed, but I meant that we would never be influenced by such a big industry as Disney. Life goes on, though, and changes must be made. So the tendency was that the employees, when they saw some small changes, would be frightened and go straight to him and complain. And he said, but if there's no change, there's no life. This book was published 2 or 3 years ago, and it's very interesting from a management and organizational point of view as well. At the very beginning of Pixar, without John Lasseter, as well as John Lasseter's creative mind, we have Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs never had an internal role. He had a sort of a shield role in foreign affairs. He looked after the stocks, but he never looked after the day-to-day runnings of the company. The great mind, the third great mind of Pixar was Ed Catmull. So the story of Pixar is a story of outsiders, because they're completely outsiders, that in very few years they reinstate themselves and are able to change things. Pixar was in fact the first company to transform animation movies, which were mostly musical, to another type of animation, which were, for example, we had the Incredibles movies like Bug's Life, more comical movies like Toy Story, etc. So animation movie becomes a real means of expression, a more complete means of expression. Another one of the great things that they did was to apply to their creativity the factor of collaboration with computer science and the best technology on the market. From this origin, which is very different, they're not in Los Angeles or California, which are the most important states for animation, but they are local. They're situated in Los Angeles, where there is also Facebook and Google, the great companies, computer companies. They brought a new way of reasoning, a new culture within the entertainment sphere. Lasseter and Cadmel have a group around them which they call Brain Trust, of directors and producers. Andrew Stanton, Pete Docton, Brett Birder, Joe Graft. And it's interesting that of these names, all of them come from the same educational background, which is CalArts. Joe Ranft died in a car accident, but until his death was one of the most important figures. And Tim Burton was also a colleague of the same school, CalArts Institute of Arts. Nine Old Men is the name that they called the Disney employees, which in the 50s looked after the Disney movies. Something that is often not said is that a couple of these people, Pete Docter and Andrew Stanton, for their work in Up, Inside Out, are actually practicing Christians. This is often not said, especially in their interviews. John Lasseter, in fact, is someone who comes from a Protestant background. Both of his parents met in university, which has a strong Malibu University, which has a strong religious background. Many of them are from the Midwest, Ohio, and near Chicago, which is an area of America which is the deeper part of America, the more traditional part of America. And they have strong religious Christian backgrounds. Ed Catmull is from Utah. All of this obviously influenced the content of the movies. And another factor influenced the movies, which is the fact that all of them are married and have children. This is interesting and very important because when they talk about their children, each one of them says that when they make their movies, they say that each movie begins from or is inspired by a real life experience with their own children. The movie on the oceans, they were working on Toy Story and Toy Story 2. He said, one of them said that he brought his son to the park, and he realized that his son was quite agitated. He kept saying, "Don't run, don't do that, be careful." And he got the idea to tell the story of a father, the father of a very anxious father, overprotective of his child. This idea came exactly when he had Monsters Inc. was actually began in the moment that he had his first child, his first experience of fatherhood. He used a very work-life balance. He used a very this term work-life balance. When they asked me about my work hours at 5:30, technically work ended. This was the company policy, because it is necessary to work within working hours, but at the same time have a normal family life. Pete Docter was therefore inspired to write this story. He was a workaholic. He was inspired to describe the story of how his children changed his approach to work. Brett Bird, we saw The Incredibles. Some of the scenes of the dinner table are the same scenes that happen in at my home. This is not an ideological position on family life, but they directly narrate true experiences. So there is this direct experience that, at least, is my direct experience. I know many scenographers and many directors, and I see that many productions are filtered by personal experience. And this is something which is very beautiful, because I think the most beautiful movies are born from deep and true experiences. In this way, these movie makers are trying to want to continue this idea that Pixar should change, but needs to be different to what was seen in Disney. John Lasseter says Walt Disney was an innovator, but John Lasseter was the daughter of Disney said, but John Lasseter was the one who probably interpreted better than my own father what Walt Disney, my father, had begun.
Thank you very much. And thank you for telling us about the lively tradition of this film studio. It looked as if it was about to collapse, and instead it changed and it survived. Now let's talk about Italian movies. Before giving the floor to Francesco, we would like to show you some parts of some clips. The first one, it's about a painter that wants to do all by himself. Sometimes a director cannot answer to every question. At 38 years old, he has already created 3 movies, a few clips, short movies. Francesco Amato's first movie was Che ci faccio qui in 2006, which was received great approval by the critics. At his institute, he could you can make a movie in order to receive his degree. Then another movie is Cosimo and Nicole in 2011, and then his third movie has recently come out, Lasciati andare. A great cast: Tony Servillo, Carla Signoris, the voice of Dory in Finding Nemo, Luca Marinelli, and so on. Before talking with Francesco, let's look at a few movies that have been his teachers and masters. It is a pleasure for us to have a young and talented director here with us. And the movies we've just seen are a legacy for the future and young directors. You all know very well the Italian comedy, great artists like Alberto Sordi, or the movie The Great War. They all had the ability of talking about very complex issues, about war, for example, through comedy. They could talk about everything, making you smile, but without ever being banal. Woody Allen is also a very famous director whose comedies are very well known. Comedy is a genre that is usually very loved by all of us. I would like to ask you, who were your masters, your teachers, and what was your journey as a director? What can you say? Thank you very much for your invitation. I'm not used to talking to such big audiences. The Italian cinema doesn't usually have this much success, so thank you very much. I hope your applause will bring me luck for my next movies. We wondered, how can we introduce the role of a director? And we thought about the scene of Truffaut's movie, the movie Day for Night. He's one of my greatest masters. I know his movies very well. And that clip, which is about minute 15, is the best definition you could ever give of a director. Often people ask me, what does a director do exactly? Even my family didn't know it at the beginning of my career. So I tried to find some answers. The director is responsible for the transposition from written text to into image. A director manages the troupe, but actually a director is someone that answers everyone's questions. Truffaut knew a lot about cinema, and he gave this wonderful definition of a director. This is exactly what happens on set. You can see the costume department, the producers, scenographers, everyone goes up to the director and they ask them about small choices, sometimes very small choices. For example, the color of the wig of an extra, or sometimes very big choices, for example, the face of the protagonist. That all of this characterizes the movie. So what can we say about a director? To talk about the role of the director, we have to talk about his tools. His main tool is choice. Being asked this many questions brings about the responsibility to make choices. We can even make movies without cameras. Someone did that, but we cannot make movies without choosing. So now maybe you can understand what are the other important tools of a director. For example, tradition. Maybe this is linked to this year's meeting's theme. Truffaut has been a great critic even before he became a director. Before I started making movies, maybe I should have watched a bit more movies and be a critic myself. Truffaut had an unbelievable knowledge of the history of cinema. And this is the second tool of a director: experience, knowledge. Something that is part of the tradition and that you cannot overlook. And every director has to bring about new changes to this tradition. The third element that makes a director is the troupe, the équipe, the team around him, people inspiring him. They give them inputs to be interested in all of the fields involved in movie making. A director is a narrator first of all, and he has to combine every department and the way they narrate this story through costumes, through makeup and so on. Well, Antonio asked me why did I decide to become a director. Well, just like Truffaut, I believe that movies were born thanks to the experience of all of us, but they develop in cinema rooms. I very often go to the cinema, even without telling my wife or my friends. That for me is a place where I can think, a place of reflection. And there I write my movies. I bring a small notebook with me. But the will to make movies for me was not born in cinemas, but thanks to the TV. During the 80s, there was a program by Sergio Zavoli that was called Viaggio intorno all'uomo, a trip around man. It had a great theme song, and this program was a kind of forum where they talked about movies and cinema, and there is where I learned about my masters, the movies that now I love, and that made me decide to study cinema and movie making. They talked about the movies by Marco Risi, for example. They showed very famous movies by Moretti or by Olmi. TV was very different back then. Thanks to TV, the field of cinema could be discovered, which doesn't happen now. This tradition is now fading. As for fathers and masters, I went to the cinema for the first time to watch Fantasia by Disney. Fantasia, sorry. Me and my parents usually went to the cinema on Christmas. And in 1987, I remember I watched the parody of the movie Star Wars. And maybe that is one of the greatest memories of my childhood. My father has taught me a lot about cinema. My father enrolled me in an English course because he thought it was very important, but I didn't even learn a word. And then he told me, you have to learn how to play an instrument. And he enrolled me in a guitar course. That was even worse. And then once he gave me a camera, very old camera, a Russian camera. And I learned how to use it very quickly, and I had a lot of fun. And I loved that gift. And he didn't give it to me by chance. He was a doctor. And by watching his work and how he chose the treatment for a patient, I understood what it means to make a portrait of someone or of something. This is how you create a new character, how you work with an actor. You have to pay attention to the character because this makes a difference. From photography, then I moved to cinema. Because for me, still pictures were not enough. I started writing. I met with great teachers. But I also met bad teachers on my way, but even they were useful to me. And then I met bad teachers that didn't give me anything. I wrote this last movie with Francesco Bruni, a great scenographer, Italian scenographer. He collaborated with Paolo Virzi. He works for the TV program Il Commissario Montalbano. He has worked with the director Presti. He was my teacher in the Institution of Arts that I attended, the National Cinema School. And from him I learned the value of a character. Nowadays, producers ask for great ideas when we make movies. Producers ask for high concept ideas, striking ideas, but a quick idea that can be told in one phrase. Very often this reduces the value of the characters. Genovese's last movie had a high concept idea, in the movie called Perfect Strangers. And of course it is a good movie, but working with Bruni I understood that you can also have a small idea, but what's important is complex characters. Characters that reflect the complexity of our times. We cannot accept flat characters. They cannot be guided by a plot that you can feel as fake. They need to be convincing. So this is why I say that Bruni has taught me how to write movies. Lately, I watched Farhadi's last movie. He won the Oscar Prize with a movie called A Separation. And I saw that it is very easy to talk about positive and happy characters, but what struck me in Farhadi's movie is the complexity of his characters. Because he creates contradictory characters, and he finds several aspects to every character, even the ones that make mistakes. He pays attention even to these characters, the ones that make mistakes. And this is what we tried to do with this movie, the one you will see tonight. Thank you, Francesco. Maybe someone will remember the beautiful movie A Separation was also showed here at the meeting a few years ago. As all of your movies, I believe that your movies are the most beautiful Italian movies. For example, Tutto quello che vuoi or Scialla.
I would like to ask Armando, what do you see? What do you think about these points on Italian cinema, on current Italian cinema? And I'd like to ask Amato his opinion on Pixar. Well, the most important thing about Pixar, and for this reason I look after a master's in training for professions in TV, because many of the principles that they apply are applicable to realities that are very smaller than the Pixar reality. We know that American cinema and is obviously the economic dimension of the cinema in the US is much bigger than what we have in Italy. They're films that cost between 100 and 150 billion, and in Italy much less, an incomparable difference. There are also a series of ideas that are perfectly applicable to the Italian situation, and in the experience of Lux Vide is a very positive one, because in our situation, as regards the development of the stories in Lux, they work on the stories in a similar way to Pixar. The story development. 4 or 5 points I'll briefly mention are the following. Pixar had very clear from the beginning, since the 90s, when computers started to be an important part of cinema, the cinema story. The most important idea is the cinema story. An acquaintance of mine sent questions to Pete Docter when Pixar wasn't that known. This girl was called Elena. She wrote a thesis. She says, how do you work, etc. And John Lasseter and Doctor said, cinema for us is secondary. For us, the most important thing is the story. The story is the first priority. So their work is often very cooperative. It has a very strong collaborative dimension. Toy Story and Toy Story 2, in fact, were developed between story developers, additional story material, and they also have a trilogy. So about a dozen directors give free consultation during the development of the 3 stories. In this way, this is this same kind of experience on a smaller level that we have here in Lux Vide. Quality is the business plan, according to Ed Catmull. It's useless to look for shortcuts. The best works are the most difficult and the most longest projects. This is in some ways applicable to Lux Vide, in others not quite. A small group of 3 people, the young people who make a short movie, can work along these criteria. They had an important moment, which was a sort of a defining moment for them. Toy Story 2 entrusted it to a team of people. They realized that Toy Story 2 was not at a sufficient level, and since the success of Toy Story 1 was so great, they had to finish Toy Story 2 within 9 months, and they started from scratch. They worked like crazy, but they managed to get it finished. Perhaps it was even better than the original Toy Story 2. The third point is the attention, a continuous attention for formation, for training, for education. it is one can learn very much by looking at movies. They are a company that look after training in a very meticulous and special way. They want that their workers that are involved in computers or accounting follow courses that they are interested in: history of art, documentaries, art, design. They want that all of the organization be under continuous training. I saw an interview with Pete Docter, and after 2 great successes, he had looked after many successes of Pixar. He followed for the 4th or 5th time an important course by McKee, and the interviewer asked him, "But why did you do a 4-day course?" And he said, "Yeah, it's true. When I'm thinking of a new movie, sometimes it helps me to see it the 4th or the 5th time, to continue to hear this course." So, apart from the specific case of this anecdote, this denotes the approach that Pixar has. This is very important. It shows the difference between those who think that they know everything and those who are in a continuous approach, in a curious approach towards learning. The 5th point is that to continue to take risks. Cadmel talks about this, talking about many experiences of risks that they took from the point of view of the management. We cannot not make mistakes. We can't avoid making mistakes. The role of a manager is to manage problems, to manage mistakes. Imagine what it must be like to invest $120 million in an animation movie with a rude old man, as is the case of Up. How much would they have risked? They risked a lot. Whereas they invested in a lot of money in a mouse in a kitchen with Ratatouille. This is a movie that you can reduce in a sentence, but their idea is to develop and thrash out the possibilities, the potential of a concept for 4 or 5 years. Or Wall-E. It's almost a mute film after most of the film is mute and set in the future. If someone had presented it to someone else, one would have said, this is a folly, it could be impossible to produce and make money on this movie. Sometimes they make sequels which are guarantees on a certain sense for success because of the success of the first one. A couple of last notes. I quoted earlier on the ability to set an approach of collaboration between teammates. This is a very important key concept for finding new solutions, and it is possible to get great results by combining skills of different people. They have a series of practices, methods, of company strategies that are that pivot around the idea of collaboration. All of these points can be taken as example for our smaller reality in Italy. Another point is the contact with common people. Every creative community has the tendency to close in on itself. Each creative world has its own logic, its own passions, its own interests, and sometimes it tends to be detached from common people. But one of the most successful movies in Italian cinema is by Giuseppe Nunziante, the director, Nunziante with Checco Zalone, which tries to re-establish this contact. And it managed to create movies that really spoke to common people, to the common people. And my last point, their ability that I said earlier to acquire, to be inspired by personal experience and touch people's sentiments, their emotions. We had the embrace between Carl and Russell in Up that we saw in the last clip. We can identify with this emotion. Some people say this is too cheap, this is too it's too easy, it's too obvious, but it carries real pieces of the truth of relationships. The grandfather who meets a young boy, a grandfather who never had a son, and the embrace of this child shows us the capacity that this means of expression has to communicate these emotions.
Cosa vedi in questi?
Thank you very much. Instead, what do you see in these movies? Well, after what Armando has said, I think it is thanks to Pixar if companies take risks nowadays. Italian cinema is always very shy. Whereas I believe that Pixar is a very brave company. For example, Disney's characters that were created before 2006 were quite fake. Whereas what I like about Pixar is that their movies talk about weak people, disabled people, the left outs, but with a positive approach. This is what fascinates me. Now, talking about Italian cinema, we always create prototypes. A good teacher of mine said, that even when we have everything under control, especially in the animation world, you are never sure of the result. But despite this, we should try and take risks. What I like about Pixar is what we saw even in the movie A Difficult Life. The combination of tragedy and comedy. I'm really jealous of how they write their writing. For example, Pixar's writing, for example, in Up, the writing is incredible. The complexity of the characters. Italian cinema used to have complex characters, deep characters, as we saw in A Difficult Life. So we should start and do this again. I believe that animation bases their work a lot on this combination between tragedy and comedy. Let's think about Bambi. And it is very evident, especially in the last Pixar movies. Maybe our cinema is not experimenting a lot in this field over the last years. Working with Francesco Bruni and Mr. Lantieri, I understood the strength of a laugh. I understood that the scenes we wrote worked only if they made us laugh. In relation to the few clips we saw, Woody Allen's clip, for example, we took them as an example. We were inspired by Woody Allen's movies, Marx Brothers movies. We studied this cinematography, this Jew cinematography, first of all because the protagonist of my movie is a Jew, played by Tony Servillo. And also because combining tragedy and comedy improves the final product, especially by using this kind of Jew irony. For Jews, irony is the key to overcome difficulties and the hard periods of history. Comedy should start talking about topical and important issues softly, with lightness. Calvino wrote in his work, lightness means that we have wings on our shoulders, that we do not have a weight on our hearts. This is the message that cinema can communicate by taking an example from 6 Memos for the Next Millennium by Calvino. So this is very important to me. Thank you, Francesco.